This has been a very challenging, difficult week, not only for so many of us in this room, but for so many of us in our greater American society as well. And perhaps among the many deaths that we read about this week, no death influenced the greater American public at large more than that of our most famous game show host, Alex Trebek. Radio and TV personality host Tony Kornheiser said it best, so I'm going to quote him directly. Trebek was the cordial, courteous, comfortable host of Jeopardy, adding that nothing defined in our day the classiness of America as much as that game show, and no person was as classy or enduring to so many of us than Alex Trebek. In our world where sometimes people get confused over the facts, Kornheiser continued, Jeopardy has no gimmicks. There are no secrets to Jeopardy. You either know the answer to the question or you don't. Today as Americans, of course, we take the honesty of our game shows for granted, but I know there are many people other than me in this room that watched the movie Quiz Show in 1994, or maybe you even lived through the 1950s, when you remember the scandal when NBC was rigging game shows and they were paying people to lose or to win as a way of trying to goose the ratings. That was not the case with Alex Trebek. For the American public, Trebek was brilliant in his simplicity and trustworthy in his manner. Trebek, by the way, y'all know, considered himself, accountable for every single episode of Jeopardy. He personally read through every single question to make sure that it was correct. He would also routinely, I'm told, take the Jeopardy test himself to make sure that he was smart enough to get onto his own game show. It is, Kornheiser coined and remarked, a lasting tribute to Alex Trebek that we will all smile for the rest of our lives and say to ourselves, game show hosts for 1,000, and we will always think of Alex Trebek. As I've said, this has not been an easy week for the American public, nor has it been an easy week for the Jewish community at large. For the Jewish community, we not only lost Alex Trebek, but we lost 3 larger-than-life Jewish scholars this week. Rabbi David Feinstein, the son of the towering giant of Orthodoxy, Moshe Feinstein, passed away at age 91. He was considered to be the most preeminent scholar of Jewish law living today in the United States. Chazan Moshe Taub was a Holocaust survivor who survived the Shoah by being part of a famous list designed by Oskar Schindler. He went to Israel after the war, he emigrated to America, and then he sang to God for the rest of his life by becoming a chazan for 40 years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And last, but certainly not least, the one that everybody has been talking about, we lost Rabbi Jonathan Lord Sacks, the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. Rabbi Sacks, who continues to be, even in death, the most influential, I would say widely revered Torah commentator of our day. There is no serious modern Jew in the world at large who studies Torah who has not quoted Rabbi Sacks, as I frequently do in my sermons, or listened to Rabbi Sacks' podcasts, as I frequently do from each week to week. And I can't help but think that this Shabbat, there therefore has to be some meaning to be drawn from the fact that so many righteous, wonderful people passed away on a week so close to Chayei Sara. Only instead of what I think that meaning is, which is what I do from each week, right? As a rabbi, I get up on the pulpit, I tell you a sermon about what I think the Torah portion means. This week, of course, I want to quote Rabbi Jonathan Sacks himself and tell you what Rabbi Sacks had to say about this Torah portion, and also what I would argue what the meaning is behind the deaths of these scholars on a week of Chayei Sara. We don't think about it all that much, but Sacks begins his Torah commentary for this week by pointing out the fact that Abraham and Sarah did not have an easy life. We think about them as the patriarch and the matriarch of the Jewish people, when in reality, their lives were quite miserable. Sarah is barren for most of her life. She is nearly twice stolen by Pharaoh and by Avimelech and taken to go live in their harems. Family rivalry between Abraham and his nephew Lot leads them to almost part ways and never see one another ever again. Sarah is jealous when Abraham takes another wife, and so she persuades Abraham to banish that son and his wife into the wilderness. And yes, we're told in last week's parashah by our commentators, Sarah's death is in no small part due to the fact that of the Akedah, that Abraham nearly sacrifices his son Isaac. She gets the word, and Sarah dies in shock from the news. Does that by any objective measure sound to any of you like Abraham and Sarah lived a charmed life? Yet what does Rashi, our Torah commentator, teach us this week about Avraham and Sarah? Rashi says that in our opening verse, the word Chaim is mentioned twice to teach us that each and every day of Sarah's life was equally good. And similarly, the Torah portion, the parashah, says that Avraham lived a life where he was blessed bakol. Abraham was blessed with everything. Why? Why, given the fact that their lives were so incredibly hard, asks Rabbi Sachs, could they be blessed with everything? Could each and every day of their lives be good? Studying this anomaly, Rabbi Sachs argues that it's because the Torah here is trying to teach us that when a person lives a life of faith, that faith helps them to encounter and understand the moments of why. When a person understands the why in their lives, then they can overcome those moments of difficulty and challenge, what Rabbi Sachs calls the how. We may not know, Rabbi Sachs argues, for example, how Abraham felt when he had to go up to Mount Moriah and nearly sacrifice his son. But what we can be sure of is that it was his faith and his sense of understanding of the purpose of his life that even in the aftermath of that terrible moment led Abraham to understand that his life was good, that it was blessed. We do not know how Sarah endured the many trials of her life, but we know, according to Rabbi Sachs, that she found serenity in death because she had a tranquility that must have been present in the rest of her life. Quote, Abraham and Sarah understood that everything that happened to them, even the bad things, were part of the journey from God. They had to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, fearing no evil, because they understood that God was with them. In 2017, Edith Eger, who survived Auschwitz, wrote about the idea of victimization. She wrote that we are all likely to be victimized at some point in our lives. At some point, all of us suffer or know the circumstances of affliction and calamity caused by circumstances or people or institutions over which we have no control. That's life, she says. That's victimization. It comes from the outside. In contrast, she writes, victimhood comes from the inside, and no one can make you a victim but you. We become victims not because of what happens to us, but when we choose to hold on to our victimization. We develop a victim's mind, a way of thinking, of being that is rigid, blaming, pessimistic, stuck in the past, unforgiving, punitive, without healthy limits and boundaries that can help us persevere. She writes that in her life, I've learned not to look for happiness because happiness is external. You were born with love and you were born with joy. Those are inside, and that's always been there. Alex Trebek was diagnosed with a nearly incurable form of cancer. But in the midst of that announcement, he didn't talk about how sad he was going to die. He said, I'm going to beat this because I still have 3 years left on my Jeopardy contract. He chose not to wallow. He chose not to be a victim. He understood his why, and that helped him to encounter, as Rabbi Sachs would have said, the painful how in his life. Cantor Taub endured the Holocaust, the worst crisis of all time for humanity. And yet he found the joy within, and he sang as a chazan to God for his entire career. He didn't give up his faith, but it made it stronger. Rabbi Feinstein, we don't talk about this much, but he spent his entire life in the shadow of a larger-than-life father who was revered and I'll bet wasn't home all that much. And yet he rose to become famous on his own. And Jonathan Sachs, Rabbi Lord Sachs, did not wallow and hide when he was diagnosed with cancer. He went on to teach and study Torah for the duration of his days. He understood his why that helped him to overcome the how, so that, like Alex Trebek, there will be no doubt this morning when we think of rabbis who teach Torah for 1,000, we will always think of Rabbi Sachs. What's the message this morning? It's that people of faith understand the why. And that helps us to find the joy in our lives, even when we have to encounter the how, the pain and the suffering that we deal with. Abraham and Sarah did it. So did all of these great people who passed away this Shabbat. And I'll bet that every one of us in this room, if we so desire, can choose to live our lives that way too. May the memories of all of these people during a week in which we read about Chayei Sara be for a blessing. Amen.